Okay, let's dive in. You sent us a stack of really compelling sources about Palantir Technologies, a company that feels, really prominent, but also kind of shrouded in mystery for a lot of people.
Absolutely. And what these sources really unpack isn't just what Palantir is, but the significant controversies that seem to follow its work, especially its deep ties with governments and, well, big corporations worldwide.
Yeah, and what jumped out immediately from the material you shared is this really fascinating question the sources wrestle with. How does all this stuff about Palantir connect back to George Orwell's 1984?
Right. So our mission, kind of in this deep dive, is to unpack all of that. We'll pull out the key details on what Palantir actually does, zero in on the specific criticisms it faces, look at what the company says in response.
And then explore those parallels the sources draw between Palantir's work and that, well, chilling world Orwell imagined.
Exactly.
This feels like more than just looking at a tech company, though. It's about data, right? Immense power, privacy, security.
Who holds the power? Yeah. And whether we're seeing echoes of that famous literary warning playing out now in our digital age, it's complex, definitely.
But the sources seem to give us a pretty clear path through it.
They do.
So stepping back for a sec, how do the sources describe Palantir? What exactly is this company like at its core?
Well, it goes back to 2003, founded by Peter Thiel and some others. And the sources consistently describe Palantir as fundamentally a data analytics company.
Data analytics.
Right.
And they provide the actual tools, the software platforms.
Exactly. Sources mention key platforms like investigative case management, ICM, that's mainly for government agencies. Then there's Gotham and Foundry.
Their main job is?
Their core function, really, across all these platforms is to aggregate data, pulling it together from lots of different, often really separate sources, all into one place.
Got it. Bring all that info together. And where does their business come from, mainly, according to the sources?
Well, the material makes it pretty clear that government agencies are major clients, a really substantial part of their revenue.
How substantial?
One source pointed out that a striking 53% of their revenue came just from government contracts back in 2020.
53%. Okay.
Yeah.
So a company built on crunching huge amounts of data, big focus on government clients. You can kind of see why this might be fertile ground for controversy. And your sources highlight quite a range of areas where Palantir faces serious criticism.
They really do. I mean, the issues span from their work with icy U.S. immigration and customs enforcement to using their tech in predictive policing.
Okay.
Big contracts with the UK's National Health Service, the NHS, their long-standing ties to military and intelligence agencies, concerns about just a general lack of transparency, backlash from inside and outside the company, and even the influence of the co-founder, Peter Thiel.
That's quite a list.
Yeah.
Let's unpack some of these specific points that sources raise and how Palantir responds. One area that seems to generate a lot of heat is their work with ICE.
Yeah, that's a major focus in the sources you send over. Palantir has contracts with ICE, providing systems like that ICM platform we mentioned.
And the criticism is?
Critics, like Amnesty International is highlighted in the sources, they argue this tech was instrumental in, well, enabling aggressive immigration enforcement, especially under the Trump administration.
And how did the sources link that to human rights concerns?
They connect the use of ICM to things like family separations, mass deportations. They detail how ICM compiles data from all these different federal agencies, FBI, CIA, DEA, allowing ICE to track and sort individuals very quickly. The worry raised is that this capability basically enables mass surveillance and specifically targets vulnerable populations.
And this ICE relationship, it's ongoing. It hasn't stopped.
No, actually, the sources mention a recent $30 million contract awarded in 2025. The aim is apparently enhancing near real-time visibility into migrant movements. Critics see that as, doubling down.
So how does Palantir respond to these specific criticisms about ICE?
Their defense, as it's laid out in the sources, is basically that they're just fulfilling legal contracts. They argue immigration policy is political, not technological. And they point out their work with ICE actually started under the Obama administration. They say their systems support legitimate border security.
Okay. Another area facing intense scrutiny, predictive policing, and the potential for bias.
Right. Police departments, cities like New Orleans, places in California, they've used Palantir's Gotham platform for this, using data patterns to try and forecast crime.
And the criticism here, as the sources highlight, is that the technology isn't exactly neutral.
Exactly. Critics argue that because the data feeding these systems often reflects historical policing patterns which might themselves be biased, the tech can just reinforce those biases, leading to disproportionately targeting communities that are already over-policed, often marginalized groups, creating what the sources call racist feedback loops.
How does the tech actually enable that loop?
Well, the sources explain Gotham pulls together huge amounts of personal data. It allows for this complex analysis to spot potential criminal activity or individuals. The worry is this analysis can happen without clear oversight, maybe without warrants. And if the underlying data or the algorithms are biased, even unintentionally, the predictions just point police back to the same communities, which generates more data from those communities, reinforcing the original bias. That cycle is the feedback loop.
And Palantir's response to these specific bias claims?
The sources note they haven't really offered detailed public responses tackling how the bias might work in their predictive policing tools, but broadly, they maintain their tools are meant to help law enforcement prevent crime, improve safety, not perpetuate bias.
Okay, let's move across the Atlantic. There's been significant controversy around Palantir and the UK's National Health Service, the NHS.
Yeah, this centers on a huge contract. 480 million was sold with NHS England for something called a Federated Data Platform, or FDP.
And the main word?
Patient data privacy. That's the core concern, amplified by critics.
And why Palantir specifically? Why the suspicion there?
Well, critics, civil liberties groups, MPs mention in the sources, they question if Palantir is really the right partner for sensitive health data, given its history with U.S. intelligence, military, and maybe a perceived lack of deep healthcare experience. The sources also stress that this big contract came after a smaller, controversial no-bid contract related to COVID data. So campaigners argue the whole process for the bigger platform wasn't transparent and maybe unfairly favored Palantir.
And there are fears about the data itself. What could happen to it?
Yes. A key fear is that even if the data is supposedly de-identified, there's always a risk of re-identification, especially if combined with other data. Critics worry this sensitive NHS data could be misused, maybe even shared with U.S. agencies.
And Peter Thiel comes into this too.
Yeah, that concern gets amplified because co-founder Peter Thiel has publicly criticized the NHS, which some see as a potential conflict of interest, or at least raises questions about his, intentions regarding the NHS data.
How do Palantir and NHS England push back on these privacy worries?
NHS England insists the data is secure, properly de-identified, and Palantir's standard line, according to the sources, is that their clients control the data, they don't own it.
But the distrust remains.
The sources suggest it does, yeah.
fueled partly by the secrecy around the contracts, heavily redacted details, things like that.
Beyond the NHS, Palantir's military and intelligence ties are just fundamental, a core part of its identity and a major source of controversy.
Absolutely. The sources really underline Palantir's deep integration. Agencies like the US CIA, NSA, international forces like the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, their software Gotham Foundry reportedly used in very sensitive, sometimes controversial operations.
What kind of operations are mentioned to the sources? Anything specific?
They reference reported use of Palantir tech in targeting operations during the Israel-Hamas conflict, and its alleged role in helping the CIA track down Osama bin Laden.
And being involved in these areas has led to pushback.
It has, externally and even internally. Former employees, some investors cited in the sources, have criticized that tools like Gotham and Foundry, while powerful, can enable surveillance, even autonomous targeting.
Autonomous targeting. Wow.
Yeah, which they fear could violate international human rights norms. The work with the IDF specifically led one investor, Store Brand Asset Management, to pull its money out over concerns about complicity in potential international law violations.
How does Palantir justify its role in these military and intelligence activities?
They defend it as crucial for national security, counterterrorism. CEO Alex Karp is quoted in the sources saying the tools are used to disrupt adversaries, make them scared.
A theme that seems to weave through a lot of these controversies is this concern about transparency, accountability.
That's a key criticism highlighted in the sources, definitely. Palantir's operations are often described as secretive. Their software, their algorithms, it's all proprietary. Not public, not open for independent checks.
Why is that secrecy seen as such a problem?
Critics argue it creates this real lack of transparency, makes accountability incredibly hard.
especially when the tech is used in sensitive areas, law enforcement, national security, public health data. It's just hard to know how decisions are being made or why something happened.
The sources also mention past incidents that have maybe fueled this distrust.
Yeah, they bring up a controversial proposal from 2011 where Palantir apparently suggested ways to discredit WikiLeaks and its supporters.
Right, I remember hearing about that.
And they also note alleged ties to the Cambridge Analytica scandal, though Palantir denied significant involvement there. But these incidents, as the sources present them, they contribute to this perception of opaque practices, raise questions about ethical lines.
How does Palantir explain this level of secrecy? What's their justification?
Usually they point to client confidentiality, given the sensitive nature of their government and intelligence work, which makes sense on one level. But critics counter that this defense also, perhaps conveniently, lets the company avoid real responsibility or scrutiny for potential misuse or negative impacts of its tools.
And this mixed sensitive work, perceived lack of transparency, it's clearly led to pushback from inside the company and out.
The sources highlight significant internal dissent, yeah. Back in 2018, over 200 Palantir employees apparently protested the ICE contracts. More recently, former employees have publicly condemned work done under the Trump administration, arguing it violated the company's own founding principles, which they said included protecting vulnerable groups.
And the public reaction? Protests.
There have been public protests targeting Palantir by privacy advocates, immigrant rights groups, even other tech workers. The sources also cite criticisms from big names in tech, like Paul Graham. He's quoted worrying that Palantir is building police state infrastructure.
How does Palantir usually respond to all this criticism, this backlash?
Often, according to the sources, by sort of dismissing the critics, CEO Alex Karp is quoted suggesting people who disagree fundamentally with the mission maybe shouldn't work there. They also try to counter the negative stuff by highlighting positive uses of their tech disaster relief, counterterrorism.
Okay, and finally, the influence of co-founder Peter Thiel. That seems to loom large in many controversies the sources cover.
Yes. Thiel's very public political profile, his support for Donald Trump, his libertarian views, the sources see this as amplifying the scrutiny on Palantir, fueling concerns about its direction.
Are there specific examples of his influence mentioned?
The sources note his public criticisms of the NHS, even of democracy itself, his ties to political figures like J.D. Vance, Elon Musk. For critics, this raises concerns that Palantir's powerful tech could align with or even enable more authoritarian agendas, especially given how deeply embedded it is with government power.
And how might this influence affect the company's business, its focus?
The sources suggest his influence might be seen in Palantir's aggressive push for government contracts, particularly during the Trump years, leading to fears the tech could be used for politicized surveillance or targeting.
So while Palantir says its work is client-driven, politically neutral, Thiel's public persona undeniably keeps the company in the spotlight. Tie it into these broader political debates based on the sources.
Absolutely, it adds a whole other dimension.
Okay, so we've unpacked what Palantir does, the huge range of criticisms: privacy, bias, transparency, ethics, mostly stemming from its powerful data aggregation and government work. Now, the sources make this really fascinating pivot. They ask how these modern controversies connect with the novel from 1949, Orwell's 1984.
It's a really potent comparison drawn in the material, yeah. Just as a quick refresher from the sources, 1984 paints this picture of a terrifying dystopian society run by Big Brother, an authoritarian regime, constant control, inescapable surveillance.
And the sources actually lay out specific parallels between that fictional world and the worries around Palantir today.
They outline several striking ones. The first, maybe the most obvious, mass surveillance, the loss of privacy.
In 1984, that's the telescreens everywhere right now. Constant monitoring, no private space, the fear it creates.
Right. And the sources connect this straight to Palantir's capabilities. By pulling together vast amounts of data from everywhere, its platforms can create incredibly detailed profiles on people. Tools like the ICE system tracking migrants in near real-time or predictive policing tech are highlighted. Critics see these as enabling a kind of mass surveillance, where governments can monitor and profile citizens on a scale that used to seem like fiction.
So the parallel is the sheer power of the tech to achieve that kind of pervasive monitoring.
Precisely. 1984 shows surveillance as openly oppressive. The sources suggest Palantir systems, even if marketed for efficiency or security, could achieve a similar result. by concentrating and analyzing personal data to track and profile, often without you even knowing.
Another parallel mentioned is centralized control, power imbalance.
In 1984, the party has absolute power because it controls all information, rewrites history, stamps out dissent, centralizes all knowledge.
And how does Palantir's work echo that, according to the sources?
They point out that Palantir's software centralizes these huge, disparate data sets, intelligence records, health data, financial info, giving its clients, these powerful governments and corporations, unprecedented centralized control over information about whole populations.
Concentrating the data concentrates the power.
Exactly. This concentration of sensitive data, plus the fact Palantir's algorithms are black boxes, basically, it raises concerns about unchecked power. Critics worry these tools could be used to manipulate or target groups without any public visibility or accountability. It echoes the party's control over information.
So the lack of transparency in the tech itself feeds that imbalance.
Absolutely. The sources argue that just like the party's power relied on controlling knowledge, the entities controlling these massive, centralized data sets via Palantir's opaque systems gained disproportionate power, operating with maybe less scrutiny than older systems.
The idea of targeting individuals, persecuting them, also comes up in both.
In 1984, the party was obsessed with finding and punishing thought criminals, often based on tiny behaviors or even just targeting potential dissenters before they did anything.
And with Palantir's applications, how's the parallel drawn?
The sources look at predictive policing here. Critics argue it can target people based on data patterns that reflect existing biases, potentially leading to unfair scrutiny. The ICE work is also cited again enabling the targeting of immigrants for deportation, sometimes vulnerable people. The fear, as expressed in the sources, is this kind of preemptive targeting or persecution based on data-driven assumptions, which feels disturbingly similar to identifying thought crime before it happens.
Identifying and flagging people using algorithms, sometimes without a clear, transparent reason.
That's the core parallel presented, using data to identify and potentially target individuals or groups, raising serious questions about whether these data-driven assumptions lead to unfair outcomes.
Systems like these must also erode trust, create a climate of fear.
That's definitely a connection the sources make. In 1984, the party creates this climate of constant fear. Everyone distrusts everyone else, even family. Because of the surveillance, the encouragement to inform, it just shatters social trust.
And Palantir, how does that link?
The sources link Palantir's contracts with agencies like ICE or past incidents like that WikiLeaks proposal to contributing to public distrust. There's this fear that personal data collected and analyzed by these powerful systems could be weaponized against individuals for deportation, profiling, other kinds of surveillance.
Which leads to a chilling effect on what people feel they can say or do.
Exactly. If you fear you're constantly watched or your data could be used against you, it can suppress free expression, maybe assembly. The sources mention those ex-users calling Palantir a police state tool. That reflects this broader anxiety about pervasive monitoring and its impact on trust, on freedom.
So the parallel is that anxiety, that fear of being watched, and how data collection impacts liberty and social interaction.
That's how it's framed, yes.
Manipulation of truth, lack of accountability, also seems relevant here.
Totally. In 1984, the party has absolute control over information, manipulates records, controls narratives, maintains its version of reality. Citizens can't challenge it. The party answers to no one.
And how does this connect to Palantir in the sources?
They highlight the opacity again. Palantir's algorithms, the secrecy around contracts like the NHS deal with all the redacted details, it makes it incredibly hard for the public, even oversight bodies, to really understand how the tech works or to challenge its use.
Right.
Critics argue this lack of transparency allows potential abuses, biased policing outcomes, unethical data use to go unchecked, creates a lack of accountability.
And Palantir's response to criticism, dismissing critics, that fits into this parallel too.
The sources note that tendency, yeah, which some see as mirroring the party's refusal to engage with dissent or allow scrutiny. The parallel is about powerful entities controlling vital information, resisting external accountability, leaving the public with limited ways to understand or challenge the system.
Finally, the whole idea of a technological dystopia seems central to the comparison.
Yeah, 1984 is like the literary example of tech used explicitly for oppression, to monitor, control, suppress thought and freedom.
And Palantir's cutting-edge tech, How does that fit?
The sources argue that while Palantir promotes its advanced data analytics for good things efficiency, the concerns around its use raise questions. Could it enable outcomes leaning toward a modern kind of technological dystopia? Their deep involvement with military and intelligence, reported roles in targeting, fears about data exploitation like with the NHS, it all suggests a potential for tech to be used to control populations in ways that echo Orwell's fears.
So while 1984 was fiction, a warning, the sources framed the debate over Palantir as whether its powerful tools, maybe in the wrong hands or without enough oversight, could actually pave the way for some of those same outcomes.
That's the chilling question the comparison forces you to confront, right? How does powerful tech intersect with state power? And what safeguards do we need to stop it becoming a tool for control instead of progress?
Now, it's important to acknowledge, and the sources do point this out, there are key differences between 1984 and Palantir's reality today.
Absolutely. Crucial differences. 1984 shows a fully totalitarian state. Zero checks, zero balances. Palantir, despite all the criticism, operates within democratic societies. It's subject to legal contracts, regulations, some level of public and government oversight, even if people argue it's not enough.
And Palantir and its supporters see the tech itself very differently than the oppressive systems in 1984.
That's right. They stress that Palantir's tech is, in their view, a neutral tool. Its value is its data processing power, which they argue can be used for significant good disaster relief, counterterrorism, making supply chains work better. That's a world away from the openly oppressive tech in the novel.
The sources keep circling back to that underlying fear. That even though it operates in democracies, Palantir's sheer power, its deep ties to powerful agencies, its lack of transparency, it could enable capabilities that resemble 1984's style surveillance and control.
Yes. The concern isn't necessarily that Palantir's big brother, but maybe that its technology provides the infrastructure that could enable a big brother-like state, especially if it's deployed without really strong ethical frameworks and accountability.
So stepping back, looking at the big picture, the sources paint. Palantir is clearly a hugely powerful player in the data world.
It really is. The sources show a company that's had immense commercial success. One source mentioned a valuation nearing $300 billion in 2025.
Wow.
Mostly by providing this unparalleled access to and analysis of sensitive data for powerful clients. But that position has also made it a constant lightning rod for public and political criticism.
And we see that whole spectrum of reaction in the sources, right? Including from like social media users.
Yeah, the sources capture that divide really well. On one side, you get these strong negative reactions, terms like sinister spy tech outfit, deep skepticism about contracts like the NHS one, big ethical concern.
Contrasted with the supporters' views.
Exactly. Supporters, as presented in the sources, argue these tools aren't just useful, they're essential. For managing national security complexities, government efficiency, tackling global challenges, and they feel the criticisms are often overblown or don't grasp the necessity of the work.
But the parallels drawn to 1984, whether you think they're over the top or not, they definitely highlight a serious ongoing debate.
They really underscore how relevant Orwell's warnings still feel about unchecked surveillance, centralized power, the potential misuse of technology, Palantir's ability to process and find insights in these vast oceans of data. Some see that as a real-world version of the kind of omniscience the party wanted in the novel.
And those direct comparisons you mentioned, from some corners calling it Big Brother tech or saying it would make Orwell blush.
Those are presented as showing the level of fear and distrust Palantir's work generates in parts of the public and among critics, even while supporters defend its vital role.
So what this deep dive into your sources really brings home is this picture of a company at the absolute cutting edge of data tech, providing tools that governments, powerful entities clearly value immensely for security, efficiency, control. But this immense power is in this constant tension with really fundamental concerns about individual rights, privacy, the potential for misuse.
And the sources consistently raise this call, for much greater transparency in Palantir's operations, for robust, independent oversight, to make sure this incredibly powerful technology is used ethically and doesn't accidentally lead us towards those dystopian outcomes.
Well, thank you so much for sharing these sources and prompting this deep dive. It really gives you a comprehensive look at Palantir, the controversies, and just the powerful questions its work raises.
It certainly does. The sources make it clear that, the potential of data analysis is vast, but the debate over the ethics, the accountability of how it's used, that's fierce, and it's far from settled. The core tension isn't just what the tech can do, But who decides how and why it's used? And critically, how much visibility do we, the public, actually get into those really powerful decisions?
It leaves you wondering, doesn't it? What does it truly take to ensure such potent technology ends up serving democracy and individual liberty rather than, chipping away at it?